What happens to our property when we die? What is a will? What is a trust? What is probate? How can we avoid probate? I'm Freeman Green. Let's take a look at that. To understand what happens to our property when we die, we need to know how each item of property is owned. There's only 4 different categories of ownership, and each category of ownership will tell us what happens to that item of property. So, I have on the board here the 4 different categories of ownership. Let's go through them one at a time. Category 1, you can own property in your own name. If you own any assets in your own name, whether it's a bank account or a home, and then you die, that property will have to go through a court process known as probate. What is probate? Probate is a court proceeding. The whole point of the court proceeding is to figure out who is going to be the rightful owner of the stuff you owned at the time that you died. And there's a process for that and a variety of different court filings and waiting periods. Probate is a process that varies from state to state. In my home state of Oregon, where I practice, probate can be pretty involved and pretty expensive. For that reason, I think of probate as having a big frowny face. It's not the end of the world, but it's something we'd like to avoid if we can. At the end of a court probate proceeding, the court is going to follow your will. What is a will? A will is your formal, written, legal instructions that say where you want your property to go when you die. Interesting thing about a will, it only covers the property that's in category 1. So really, a will is just instructions to the probate court, telling the probate court where you want your property to go when you die. What if you don't have a will? If you don't have a will that you've created, the state of Oregon, in my home state, has created a will for you. And that is what will serve as your will. So at the end of the probate, the court follows your will, and then the beneficiaries named in your will inherit. Category 2, you can own property joint with more than one owner. This is commonly referred to as owning property jointly with rights of survivorship. What happens to jointly owned property when you die? It just passes directly to the surviving owner. No probate required. You can just use a death certificate, work with the bank or the real property records office to update the title, update the ownership to show that it's owned in the survivor's name. But you'll note that there's a problem with that. If one owner dies and we have then one remaining owner, that is now owned in one person's name, and we're back in category 1, which means we're back in the probate category. So this is ultimately not the best way to avoid probate. Very common for a married couple to own property jointly. If they both die at the same time, that property is going to go through probate. Category 3, we can own property in our own name, but with a beneficiary designation on it. This is very common with assets like retirement accounts, life insurance policies. You can't even put these on bank or investment accounts. To put a beneficiary designation on an asset, what you do is you fill out a form. The form goes on file with the company that holds the asset. And then when you die, that asset can pass directly to the named beneficiaries free of probate. So this works quite well for avoiding probate. But there's a downside to it. There's not a great way to put a beneficiary designation on land. So if you own land, for example, if you own a home, then usually what you'll do to avoid probate is to use something called a trust, often referred to as a living trust. What exactly is a trust? Well, it's something that you create. It can own property, and it can cause that property to pass on to the named beneficiaries free of probate. I think of a trust as just being a will that avoids probate. That's really all that it is. If you were to sit down and read a trust, you would almost think you were reading a will. It would say who you want your property to go to when you die, who you want to be in charge of that process. But a trust, unlike a will, can own property. And for that reason, it can pass the property on to the beneficiaries free of probate. An analogy I like to use for trusts, I think of trusts as just being a bucket. It's a bucket that you create. You then take things that you own that would go through probate, and you change the ownership on those assets to put them into the bucket so that they are owned and controlled through the bucket. And you get to create the rules of the bucket. Typically, those rules would say, while you are alive and able, you are in charge of the bucket. You do anything you want with the assets in the bucket. If you become incapacitated, then the person you name to be in charge of the bucket will step in and will handle those assets and manage them for your benefit, pay your bills, and so on. Then, if you die, the bucket instructions will say who you want to inherit and how will they inherit. So a trust works very well for avoiding probate. There are a couple of downsides to a trust that you need to be okay with before you would use a trust in your estate planning. Downside 1, a trust costs more to implement than just a simple will plan. Downside 2, a trust will take more work to implement. Why? Because after you sign the document, you need to take the things you own in these categories and change ownership. And that requires some work on your part. Not a tremendous amount of work, but it does take some attention to those items. The philosophy is that a trust, even though it's some additional work and expense today, that it saves work and expense over the long run by avoiding a court probate. Another important thing to know about estate planning in general and doing a will or a trust, the reality is it's not going to save you money. You will be deceased. You're not going to be the one saving the money and the time and hassle if you avoid probate. It's your loved ones that will benefit from it. Your spouse, your children, the folks that you have named to inherit at your death. So it's not something you really do for you. It's something you do for your loved ones to benefit from in the future. So that is what happens to our property when we die. That is how we can set things up to avoid probate.
Thank you for watching. I hope that was helpful to you. If you think that video might be helpful to someone else, please feel free to share it with them. And if you think that our law office might be able to help you with trusts, probate, or estate planning, please feel free to contact us. Thank you.